There is much debate over Jesus' teachings on the subject of divorce. One major problem is the mistranslated word. The Greek word apolio means to set free, to let go, dismiss, to release. But the law of Moses had two requirements. They're found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. It reads, "When a man have taken a wife and married her, and it comes to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house." In Deuteronomy, Moses established two requirements for marriage and two requirements for divorce. The first requirement was the man was to take the wife. This was called a betrothal. In this process, they would draft a marriage agreement, which was called a ketubah. This had to be done in the presence of a priest and written out by a scribe. This was the beginning of their espousal period, as we can see with the story of Mary and Joseph. The second requirement was the marriage, in which the nuptials were exchanged. This would generally occur about 12 months after the betrothal. Then we have the two requirements for divorce. The first is the writing of the bill of divorcement, which was done at the court with priests present, as well as a scribe. The scribe had to write out the bill of divorcement and give it to the man, in which he would then place it into the hand of the woman. The second requirement was that the woman was to be sent away. The Hebrew word is shalah, which means send her. This word means to send away, or let go. We can find this word used in Genesis chapter 21 at verse 14, as it talks about the relationship between Abraham and Hagar when he sent her away. In the Greek, we use the word apolio, which means the same thing, to send away, to bid to leave. This word apolio does not mean divorce. This is the same word used when Jesus would send away the multitude. Jesus did not divorce the multitude, he dismissed them and released them or sent them away. We can find this in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, we find the phrase put away, which is the word apolio, which we would use the term separate. So the scripture reads, "But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away apolio, separate from his wife, except in the case of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is apolio, committeth adultery." We do not find the word divorced used in this passage. So Jesus is describing a couple that is separated and not a couple that is divorced. In Matthew 19, verse 9, we find Jesus describing a couple in a very similar circumstance. This is a couple that is not divorced, but a couple that is still separated. They're still legally married. In Mark chapter 10, verse 11, it says, "Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her." Once again, we find the word apolio. This is still a couple that is married. In Mark 10, verse 12, we find Jesus stating, "If a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery." Once again, we find the word apolio. But what's very interesting about this statement is women could not legally divorce their husbands in ancient Israel. The best a woman could do was go to the priest, to the court, and ask them, make a request for them to speak to the husband and possibly compel him, depending on the circumstances, to divorce the woman. So women could not legally divorce their husbands in Israel. There were special cases in which the court would require the husband to divorce his wife, but those were under certain circumstances. One would be if the man was sterile, but we'll discuss that at another time. Another passage is Luke chapter 16, verse 18, which reads, "Whosoever putteth away his wife apolio and marries another," there's no divorce has occurred. "They commit adultery, and whosoever marries her that is put away or separated from her husband committeth adultery." So Jesus is really describing polygamy or bigamy. So in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, we find this couple that's still married, and Jesus is saying that the exception to this would be in the case of adultery. Why was fornication the exception? Why was adultery the exception to this scenario? Adultery was a crime punishable by death. According to the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, it states that the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress, shall surely be put to death. And then also in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, it states, if a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So shalt thou put away evil from Israel. Many teach that Jesus was changing the law. They understand that adultery was punishable by death, and so they teach that Jesus was extending grace and mercy. He's teaching love. But this is not true. This would be an abolishment to the law of Moses, a change. And Jesus clearly stated in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, I did not come to abolish the law. He did not come to change the law. He did not come to make the law void. These conclusions are drawn because many people do not understand the law of Moses. So once again, we have a scenario in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 of a couple that is only separated. They have not dissolved their marriage. So they're on the verge of entering into a polygamous marriage. Why was adultery the exception? If you notice Jesus' description, he's describing a woman entering into another marriage, a second marriage, and a man that enters into the marriage with that woman, he's saying is an adulterer. This situation only happened under certain circumstances. A woman found guilty of adultery could not remarry. In that case, she would be stoned to death. And this would free the man from the marriage, allowing him to remarry. And of course, in that circumstance, a divorce would not be needed. So adultery was the exception to the rule because adultery was punishable by death. But Jesus is clearly describing a situation where the woman entered into a second marriage. Now, a woman could not be remarried in Israel unless she had her bill of divorcement, which was called a get. She was required by law to present her bill of divorcement to the priest. A woman could not get married unless she had her bill of divorcement. But Jesus is clearly describing a woman who has entered into a second marriage. How is that possible? This only occurred if it was an adulterous marriage. And there was only two circumstances in ancient Israel in which a woman could enter into an adulterous marriage. The punishment for adultery was mandatory death, but the punishment for an adulterous marriage was mandatory divorce. Understanding the laws that pertain to an adulterous marriage will cause Jesus' statements to be completely clear. Join us in the next video. Thank you for joining us on today. Check out our website, thedivorcedchristian.com. All this information I'm sharing you can be found in my book. I'm also covering it on the podcast show, the Divorced Christian Podcast Show, which can be found on iTunes as well as on Spotify. All that information can be found there on the website at thedivorcedchristian.com. If you're viewing this on a platform where you can like, share, subscribe, and follow, please do so. I would appreciate it. And until next time, be blessed.